It's kind of interesting, but most of the legislators that I really dealt with and really enjoyed working with were women. And that has a lot to say about them more than it has to say about me. I found the women I worked with better qualified. They were actually more trustworthy. They were open to new ideas and more willing to seek common ground. And so it's no surprise I kind of leaned that way. Linda Murken is that type of person, and that's why I'm pleased to be here to support her campaign for Story County Supervisor. I first met Linda when I was the Floyd County representative on the 2nd Judicial District Department of Corrections, and I was immediately recognized how detailed she was, how hard she worked, how dedicated, and how very competent she was. It was a very big organization that spanned 22 counties. It had a multitude of funding streams from federal and state government, and managing that group and that group of supervisors is, I'm sure, where Linda really got some of her first calling for public service, and I know that she's going to be well qualified when she's elected. I served 6 years on the county board, then served 12 years in the legislature, and then now I'm back and completing my 2nd term on the county board again. And the supervisors get their hands in an awful lot of things. And they're both the executive and the legislative branch of county government. And so they do the day-to-day affairs, they manage the day-to-day affairs of the counties, they appoint people to boards and commissions, the very important things. They set the tax levies for things called the General Supplemental Levy, the Rural Services Fund, and they determine the priorities of the county by how they're funding, and that's no different than any branch of government. They also write the ordinances, which I've always kind of had fun when I got back to the board and learned that that's a real important tool too. And like Floyd County, here in Story County, I understand there's only 3 supervisors. And that means that if you actually have an agenda and you have a platform and you want to get some things done, you only have to convince one other supervisor to get that accomplished. And so I know that Linda is ready to put forth a bold agenda for this county and how important that is. You know, in any level of government, you can see it at the legislature, you'd see it at county boards, you'd see it at Congress. I know who represents you now. And who represents me, more so. There are people who kind of sit on the back bench and don't really contribute a lot, and there are also people that are really more or less obstructionists, and we really need to get them out of office. But there's an old saying in politics that I always thought is appropriate, that you have to stand for something or you're going to fall for anything. And I'd like to talk briefly about 2 such important issues that we're dealing with in Iowa today. And at the top of nearly every candidate's list, whether it's a supervisor, state representative, candidate for governor, is the issue of mental health. And how should we address the current crisis that we have in Iowa's mental health system? And access to critical mental health services is something that every supervisor candidate needs to know about. An inadequate number of beds for mental health patients statewide, and the privatization of Medicaid services by the state of Iowa has really caused some issues and has put many of our most vulnerable citizens at risk, and we really must do better. We need to adequately fund mental health care to make sure that individuals need and have an access to it close to where they live. We also need to address the shame and stigma that some people have when they have to seek mental health services. The rise in the number of suicides in nearly every county in Iowa is particularly troubling. Suicide rates of veterans suffering from PTSD, or farmers, or young adults is alarming. This is a personal issue to Denise and I. because we lost our son Alex to suicide 2 years ago. And now we're involved in suicide prevention work, and we know the importance and the fact that we have to reach out to people when they're troubled, and those people with mental health services need that. And it's more than okay to seek help. It's something we need to do. A second key county issue that's important is water quality. And when I got to greet former Representative Ralph Rosenberg when I came in here tonight, we immediately started talking about his service on the Environmental Protection Committee. And those were some of the glory days in the Iowa legislature when we got some things passed. The Groundwater Protection Act, I believe it was passed in '85, led to some major initiatives in Iowa. We really talked about and really dealt with clean water issues back then. It was very important. We set into place a number of things that are very important that's still in place today. But currently there are more than 750 impaired waterways in the state of Iowa, and that number is growing and not getting any less. And I believe Squaw Creek here in Story County is one of them. But instead of addressing the issue and trying to do something, our friends in the Republican-controlled legislature passed a bill this year that something that we used to call a fig leaf bill. In other words, it was just something that would show that we did something, but the funding stream was so small, it was so voluntary based, and it actually took money from programs that we really don't need to take money from or shouldn't be, that it was also heralded by the livestock industry, the agribusiness industry, and unfortunately it's a long time coming before we see any real impacts in water quality. So, you know, in many of the states' impaired waterways, E. coli, a bacteria, is the primary issue. I know Selden and I were talking about this yesterday, and it's probably no wonder, considering the fact that for every person that lives in Iowa, there are 7 hogs in the state of Iowa, 3 million people, about 21, 22 million hogs, and they produce manure at a very high rate. It's untreated, it's spread on our fields, and it gets into our water supplies. It's just a fact of life. If you connect the dots, that's kind of what happens. Now, I'm a grain farmer, and I also want to point out that the phosphorus that's applied to my fields and the nitrogen, if I don't treat that properly, that also ends there. It also creates algae blooms, and that's what we're seeing in so many areas, and why we have lakes, and sometimes we can't even swim in them because they're not fit for it. These are just issues that county supervisors get to deal with. In Floyd County, we have created something that we started back after the flood of 2008 called the Watershed Management Authorities, and we have authorities with 22 different cities and soil and water conservation districts up there, and so that's a step in the right direction, but we need to do a little more than that. I'm probably known for a couple of things in the legislature. One I'm very proud of, and that is making the state capitol a safe place to visit for people with disability issues. And but I'm also probably known for something that I thought was going to be a lot better when we wrote it, and that's the master matrix. It's kind of got a funny sound to it, the master matrix. But anyway, back in 2002, they finally, the Republicans were getting in control, and they actually were in control of both the House and Senate, but not the governorship. Governor Vilsack was there. And they appointed a 12-person committee, 3 members from each body, from Democrats and representatives, and we met in private session behind closed doors, and Stuart Iverson was kind of the leader, and they called us the 12 Apostles. And I did vote for the bill in the end, but I'm kind of the Judas now because it's really failed. I had high hopes for it because it was intended to give counties the ability to weigh in on siting without really providing them any siting control. And but it hasn't worked out very well. What has happened is it's a series of questions And counties that adopt these things, and there's about 85 of them, are required to adopt them every year. And then the citing of CAFOs go through a process, this master matrix process. There's 44 questions, a total of 888 points, and you only have to get 440 to pass the matrix. And not very many tests that you give, you get to have only have 50% score and you get a passing grade, but that's the way it is with the master matrix. And what happens is once they get 50% of the points, they stop answering questions because they don't want to be responsible for any more of the additional qualifications that they need to do. So it's like a pass-fail test that has failed Iowans, and we really need to change it. Actually, I kind of think if I asked a few of the people in this room, we probably need to do something more than change it. I think we need to get rid of it. And I think we need local control of citing, and personally, my viewpoint, because I know there are individual counties that have individual concerns about our geology and our neighborhoods that aren't addressed in a statewide basis. We have karst topography in northeast Iowa. It's a fractured bedrock, and whatever is spread on top, the manure, the farm chemicals, or whatever, industrial chemicals, goes through the bedrock into our groundwater. So we have a unique characteristic, and that is not identified properly in the matrix. But anyway, the county supervisor's role is important, and we need people on the board who can understand how to review one of these things and actually look at it and make sure all those questions are scored properly and can ask questions at the hearings of the applicants. What happens is generally the people that own the hogs probably live in a gated community in Des Moines. The people that own the buildings get the manure. They work on a per head basis for a contractor, and they don't live next to the facility. But the neighbor that lives 1,876 feet away from one can have 5,000 head of confined livestock immediately next to them for the rest of their lives. And that's just not right. So there needs to be some changes there, and we need to have supervisors like Linda who are committed to working on that issue. So please don't remember me for all my work on the master matrix, because now I kind of think it's something that we really need to redo. Finally, I just want to say I've somehow made it through 10 general elections. I guess 1, 2, 3, 4 as supervisor and 6 as on the board of, or on the legislature. And I know that at supervisors' races, sometimes it gets to be kind of like a popularity contest, and people really don't understand the issues or they don't dig into it. It's just like, oh, I know someone, he'd do a good job. Well, when you think about Linda, I was really impressed with her brochure and what she has to say here, because she tells us why she's running. It's a lot more than just a bio. She tells us why she wants to do this, and she tells us what she's going to do when she gets there. And I'm very impressed with her. I hope that all of you in your conversation with your friends and neighbors go out and talk to them and tell them why you support Linda, and that you help her campaign out, because we really do need people who are dedicated to this job, who have a background, and who have share the same values that we do.